Jandora was a peaceful village where the sounds of birds filled the air and the scent of fresh earth lingered after every rainfall. Among its simple, yet hard-working people, lived a girl named Tisha. She was known for her gentle heart, always willing to help the elderly carry their baskets, share her food with those in need, and bring joy to those around her with her kindness. She was the only daughter of Baba Osei, a respected craftsman whose hands created the finest wooden carvings and furniture in the land. People traveled from far and wide to buy his work, and though he was not the wealthiest man, he provided a comfortable life for Tisha. She adored her father, and for many years they lived happily together in their small but warm home. However, happiness did not last forever. When Tisha's mother passed away, a deep sadness settled over their home, and Baba Osei, longing for companionship and help in raising his daughter, decided to remarry. His new wife, Zuena, arrived with sweet words and a gentle smile, promising to love Tisha as her own. At first, she appeared kind, bringing gifts and speaking softly to the girl, but in her heart, she saw Tisha as a burden. She had hoped to marry Baba Osei for wealth, assuming he had hidden riches from his successful craftwork. But she soon realized that while he was comfortable, he was not as wealthy as she had imagined. As time passed, Zuena's kindness faded, revealing her true nature. She began to treat Tisha with cold indifference, giving her the smallest portions of food and forcing her to do all the household chores. Baba Osei, blinded by love and trust, did not notice the change in his wife's behavior. He believed she was simply teaching Tisha discipline, and when Tisha tried to speak up, he dismissed her words, thinking she was just struggling to adjust to a new mother. One fateful season, Baba Osei fell gravely ill. His once strong hands trembled and his body weakened, leaving him unable to work. The family's income dwindled, and Zuena, instead of caring for him, became bitter and frustrated. She took complete control of the household, selling some of his carvings and keeping most of the money for herself. With her husband bedridden, she no longer bothered to hide her cruelty. Tisha became a servant in her own home, forced to fetch water, clean the house, and cook meals that she barely got to eat. The villagers noticed the change, but Zuena was cunning. In public, she pretended to be a grieving wife, speaking about how difficult it was to care for a sick husband and a child. Many sympathized with her, unaware of the suffering Tisha endured behind closed doors. Then came the night that changed everything. A wealthy merchant, cloaked in fine robes, arrived in Jandora. He was tall and mysterious, his face partially hidden behind a golden mask, and he rode a horse of deep ebony. He claimed to be in search of a young servant and was willing to pay handsomely for one. The villagers whispered among themselves, uneasy about the idea of selling a child. But Zuena saw an opportunity. Gold, more than she had ever dreamed of, was being offered for something she considered worthless. Without hesitation, she led the merchant to her home and presented Tisha as if she were an item to be traded. She is strong, obedient, and hard-working, Zuena lied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She will serve you well. Tisha's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at her stepmother in horror. Please, don't do this, she begged, her voice shaking. Zuena did not even glance at her. The merchant studied the girl for a moment, then reached into his robe and pulled out a pouch, heavy with gold coins. He placed it in Zuena's eager hands, and without another word, he gestured for Tisha to follow him. Tears streamed down her face as she was led away, her bare feet dragging through the dirt road of Jandora. She looked back one last time, hoping her father would appear, hoping someone would stop this. But Baba Osei was too weak, too sick to even know what was happening. The village was silent, the people watching, but saying nothing. Tisha climbed onto the horse behind the masked stranger, her hands clutching the fabric of his cloak. As the hooves thundered against the earth, she felt her home disappear behind her. Fear gripped her soul. Where was she being taken? What fate awaited her in the hands of this mysterious man? The journey was long and silent. The stranger did not mistreat her, nor did he speak. He rode through the dense forests, past rivers that glowed under the moonlight, and across hills that seemed endless. The wind was cold against her skin, and though she was terrified, something deep inside told her this was not the end of her story. After hours of travel, they finally reached a place unlike anything Tisha had ever seen. Before her stood a grand palace, its towering walls bathed in the golden light of torches. It was far away from Jandora, hidden deep within the hills. The gates opened, and the stranger led her inside. Tisha's heart pounded. Who was this man? Why had he bought her, and what kind of life awaited her in this palace of mysteries? Baba Osei had always been a strong and hard-working man, But when illness struck, everything changed. His once steady hands, known for carving the finest wood in Jandora, now trembled with weakness. His body, once full of life, became frail, and soon he could no longer work. The man who had once been the pillar of the household now lay on his mat, unable to even sit up without help. The sickness drained him, and the more he suffered, the more Zuwena's heart grew cold. At first, she pretended to care, bringing him food and placing a wet cloth on his forehead when the fever raged. But in truth, she was growing impatient. Baba Ose was no longer useful to her, and with no money coming in, life became difficult. She hated struggling, hated living in a house where there was no wealth. She started selling Baba Ose's carvings, keeping most of the money for herself while giving the bare minimum to feed him and Tisha. But even that wasn't enough for her greedy heart. As Baba Ose's condition worsened, Zuwena took complete control of the home. She no longer pretended to be kind to Tisha. The girl became nothing more than a servant in her own house, forced to wake before dawn and work until late at night. She fetched water from the river, swept the dusty floors, washed clothes until her fingers ached, and cooked meals she was barely allowed to eat. If she ever slowed down or made a mistake, Zuwena's sharp tongue lashed at her like a whip. "You are useless, just like your father," Zuwena would sneer, shoving more work into her hands. "At least prove yourself useful before you grow up and become a burden like him." Tisha never complained. She knew her father was too weak to defend her, and she didn't want to add to his worries. She bore the pain in silence, hoping that one day things would change. She believed that if she just endured, Baba Ose would get better, and everything would return to the way it was before. But one fateful night, everything took a turn for the worse. A stranger arrived in Jandora, riding a tall black horse. He wore dark robes, and a golden mask covered the upper half of his face. He carried himself with an air of power, and though no one knew who he was, his presence sent a hush over the village. He went straight to the market square, where he called out for the villagers to gather. "I seek a young servant," he announced in a deep, commanding voice. "One who is hard-working and obedient. I am willing to pay generously in gold." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. It was not common for strangers to come offering gold in exchange for a child. Some whispered that he was a wealthy merchant, while others feared he was something far worse. No one spoke up. No one dared to offer their child. But Zuwena saw only the glint of gold. Without hesitation, she pushed through the crowd and stepped forward, forcing a smile onto her face. "I have a girl for you," she said sweetly. "She is strong, hard-working, and will serve you well." The villagers gasped. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Tisha, Baba Ose's daughter? Surely this was a cruel joke. But the look in Zuwena's eyes was real. She meant every word. Before Tisha could understand what was happening, Zuwena grabbed her arm and dragged her forward, presenting her as if she were an object to be sold. Tisha's heart pounded. Fear gripped her chest like a tight fist. "Stepmother, no, please," she begged, her voice trembling. She turned to the villagers, hoping someone would stop this madness, but no one spoke. Some looked away, others lowered their heads. No one wanted to interfere in another family's matter. The stranger studied Tisha for a long moment. His golden mask revealed nothing of his expression, but finally, he reached into his robe and pulled out a heavy pouch filled with gold coins. He tossed it to Zuwena without a word. The woman caught it greedily, her fingers trembling with excitement as she opened the pouch and admired the wealth inside. Tisha felt as if the ground had been pulled from under her feet. Her own stepmother had just sold her like a piece of livestock. The stranger turned to leave, motioning for Tisha to follow, but she stood frozen in place, shaking her head, unable to move. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She turned to Zuwena one last time, hoping, praying that this was some kind of mistake. "Please, don't do this," she whispered. But Zuwena's eyes remained cold. "You were never worth much to me anyway," she said, tucking the pouch of gold into her sash. "At least now you're good for something." And with that, she turned away, walking back toward the house as if nothing had happened. Tisha felt the stranger's firm hand on her shoulder. He did not pull or force her, but his grip was strong, leaving her no choice. Slowly, she followed him, each step feeling heavier than the last. The villagers watched in silence, their faces full of pity, but none of them dared to intervene. As the stranger helped her onto his horse, Tisha cast one last glance at her home, the place she had always known, the father she was leaving behind, the life that had just been stolen from her. Then, with a flick of the reins, the horse galloped away into the darkness, carrying her toward a future unknown. Tisha clung to the stranger's cloak, as the horse galloped through the darkness. The cold night air stung her skin, but it was nothing compared to the fear twisting inside her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with questions she dared not ask. Where was he taking her? What would happen to her? Would she ever see her father again? The man who had bought her said nothing. His dark robe billowed in the wind, and the golden mask on his face caught the moonlight, making him look even more mysterious. He did not pull or hurt her, but his silence was unsettling. Tisha wanted to ask him who he was, but she was too afraid. Instead, she gripped the horse tightly and kept her eyes on the road ahead, watching as the familiar trees of Jandora faded into the unknown. The journey was long, stretching far beyond the lands she had ever known. They rode through thick forests, where the branches swayed like whispering spirits. They passed rivers that shimmered under the moon, their waters rushing over smooth stones. Hills rose and fell in the distance, their shadows stretching across the land. Tisha had never traveled so far before. Her village, her father, her past, everything she knew, felt like a distant dream. Hours passed and exhaustion crept over her. Her arms ached from holding on. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake. She could not afford to be weak. She had no idea what awaited her at the end of this journey. Just as the first light of dawn touched the sky, they reached a place unlike any Tisha had ever seen. Before her stood a grand palace, its golden rooftops gleaming under the morning sun. Tall stone walls surrounded it, stretching high into the sky as if guarding a great secret. The gates, made of heavy iron, slowly creaked open as they approached, revealing a courtyard so vast it felt like another world. Servants dressed in fine robes moved about in silence, their eyes lowered, their steps hurried. Tisha's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary home. This was the dwelling of someone powerful. The stranger brought the horse to a stop and dismounted gracefully. He turned to her and offered his hand. She hesitated, but knew she had no choice. Slowly, she took his hand and climbed down, her legs weak from the long ride. Now that they had arrived, the reality of her situation sank in. She was alone in a strange place, surrounded by people she did not know, under the care of a man whose face she had not even seen. Who was this man? Why had he bought her? And what did fate have in store for her in this palace hidden deep within the hills? Tisha braced herself for the worst as she stepped into the grand palace. She had expected cold stone floors, dark rooms, and a life of endless work. But to her surprise, the place was nothing like she had imagined. Instead of being thrown into a servant's quarters, she was led through long hallways adorned with golden lanterns and intricate carvings on the walls. The air smelled of fresh flowers and scented oils. Soft rugs cushioned her tired feet, and everything around her shimmered with a beauty she had never seen before. A woman dressed in fine silk appeared before her and gestured for Tisha to follow. She was taken to a spacious room with a large bed covered in soft blankets. A tray of food was waiting for her: steaming rice, roasted meat, and fresh fruit that smelled sweet and inviting. A beautiful dress was neatly folded on a chair, far finer than anything she had ever worn. Tisha hesitated. Why was she being treated this way? She had been sold like a servant, yet here she was, given food, clothes, and a comfortable place to rest. It made no sense. Was this some kind of trick? For days, no one forced her to do any work. She was allowed to wander the palace, eat when she wanted, and sleep in peace. But despite the comfort, she could not shake off the confusion in her heart. Who was the man who had brought her here? Why had he bought her? Finally, one evening, she was summoned to a grand chamber. The walls were lined with golden torches, casting a warm glow across the room. In the center stood the mysterious stranger who had taken her from Jandora. But this time, he was different. Gone was the dark robe and golden mask. Now, he wore royal garments, an embroidered tunic, a sash of deep blue, and a golden crown resting on his head. His face, now fully visible, was strong and noble, his eyes sharp, yet kind. Tisha's breath caught in her throat. "I am Prince Malu," he said, his voice steady, "the rightful heir to the kingdom of Tandoro." Her heart pounded. A prince? She had been sold to a prince. He took a step closer, watching her reaction carefully. "I know you are confused, but listen carefully. I did not buy you to make you a servant. I was searching for someone different from the women of the court, someone whose heart was pure and strong." Tisha's hands trembled as she tried to process his words. "But why me?" she asked softly. Prince Malu studied her for a moment before speaking. "I have heard of you, Tisha. Your kindness, your patience, Your strength in the face of cruelty. I wanted to see for myself if you were truly different. She stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. All her life, she had been treated as nothing more than an unwanted burden, and now, a prince was telling her that her heart, her kindness, was something worth seeking. Prince Malu's voice was gentle but firm. Beauty fades, riches can be stolen, but a kind heart remains. That is the kind of woman I need by my side. Tisha felt her world shift. She had been taken from everything she knew, sold by the one person who was supposed to protect her, and yet, fate had brought her to a place where she was valued not for what she looked like or how much she was worth, but for who she truly was. For the first time since leaving Jandora, she felt something stir in her chest. Hope.